Welcome everyone to another episode of Are You There Ghost? It's me, Chiwan. Today I'm so excited to have the amazing Lee Murray. Um, Let me read you a short version of her bio because she's done so many incredible things. Lee Murray is a writer, editor, poet, and screenwriter from Zealand, Aotearoa.
Aotearoa, well done.
Sarah. Yeah. A U.S.A. Today bestselling author. Her titles include the Tane McKenna Adventures, supernatural crime noir series, The Path of Ra with Dan Rabart,
Ray Bats, yep.
Ray Bart's fiction collection, grotesque monstrous stories, and several books for children. Her many anthologies include Hellhole, Black Cranes with Genevieve Flynn, and Unquiet Spirits with Angela Yuriko Smith. And her short fiction appears in Weird Tales, Space and Time, and Grimdark magazine. Multiple Bram Stoker Award, Australian Shadows, and Sir Julius Vogel Award winner. Lee is New Zealand's only Shirley Jackson Award winner, a NZSA Honorary Literary Fellow, a Grimshaw Sargison Fellow, and the 2023 NZSA Laura Solomon Cuba Press Prize winner. Please welcome Lee Murray. Hi, Let's go.
Thank you. I really need to get that bio shortened. It's just way too wordy.
But you've done so many things. You have the even wordier bio. I'm of mixed feelings on that because some people really deserve, like, people need to know all the amazing things they've done. But then you're right, like you're at a reading and someone reads a bio for 10 minutes, you're like, oh, thank you again for getting on the show. I went to my first StokerCon this year and went to the reading of your anthology. That was one of the most ridiculously stunning readings I've been to.
Oh, thank you. Wasn't it amazing? You're talking about this anthology here at Spirits, which is a collection of essays by Asian women in horror. Yeah, I know. It felt that way for me too, because for many of those women, it was the first time I'd met them in person. And they are just as amazing in person as they are on the page. And then to hear those collective voices reading from their really chill in this collection was just, it made me want to cry all over again. It was uplifting. And yes, it was almost spiritual, wasn't it? It just really felt just so powerful. And I think I was very lucky because I actually contacted Sarah Tantlinger, who was convening and organizing the convention along with Michael Anson and I'm going to say Ben Rubin. And they were super amenable to sort of being able to put the group together, because normally the readings are just one person reads and the next person reads, but being able to sort of collectively bring the group together and sort of show the connections and also the differences between those various essays was just a wonderful experience and really powerful. I'm very grateful to them for allowing us that opportunity.
Yeah, is the whole book essays?
Yes, it's all essays, but they're actually messays. So we wanted a form that would allow some freedom for people to tell their personal stories through essay, but also to use things that contribute to essay. And so a mess are kind of a little bit more meandering and involves personal reflections and all of those things that incorporate. So it could be an academic journal reference, or a piece of poetry, or an observation, or even, a piece of prose that has informed your perspective. And so those were really insightful and interesting to be able to put together essays in that way. They are a bit different from personal essays, and I think a little bit more accessible in some ways than an academic piece of writing. So yeah, I'm very proud of the way the work came out.
Yeah, it's exactly what you said. Like, for me, horror, for some reason, whether it's horror TV or movies or writing, has always connected with me emotionally more than any other genre, even though I don't write it. And so at that reading, every piece just hit me on a weird personal emotional place. And I was like, what the hell is going on with this book? So yeah, that was stunning. Incredible work, Lee.
Oh, thank you. You when when you curate something like this, and you have a general idea, and you know that it's sound, especially when a publisher jumps on board. Thank you, Black Spot Books and Lindy Ryan. But also, that you never know what the writers will bring you and how they might interpret that theme. And honestly, they brought their A game. Just some of these essays are some of the most powerful essays I've ever read. And so to get the privilege of getting those kinds of pieces of writing, which are groundbreaking and transformational, not just for the writer, but also the reader. I mean, I just bawled my eyes out when I first read some of these essays. And so, yes, and I think that is the wonderful power of horror, in that it's affective with an A. It makes you feel something and brings you
Yeah.
along for the journey. And these essays really do that. So thank you to all the women involved who just,
Mm,
as I say, brought their A
incredible
game,
work.
because
Yeah.
they're really
Yeah.
special essays and not something I've read before in any other format. They just brought something a little bit different and a little bit new. So
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of that anthology, like how did it first begin, germinate in your head? Like, this is something I want to put together.
I should never speak with Angela Eureka Smith. I don't know if you've ever spoken with her, but as soon as you walk away, you realize you've got another project on your hands.
Oh, she's one of those.
Yeah, she's one of those people, those kind of community builders, like, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
wait a minute. What we do? And then suddenly you realize you've got 6 months more work on your plate. But yeah, no, actually, it kind of came out of the Black Cranes movement. This book here, has just actually, have I got 2 versions of it? Yes, I've got this version here, which was the original version put out by Omnium Gatherum,
Yeah.
and then reprised this year by our wonderful friends at Raw Dog Screaming Press in this new collector's hardcover, which is just stunning. Another Greg Chapman cover. Dog Screaming Press put out this new version of Black Cranes earlier in the year, which is a collector's item and a hard copy with a gorgeous Greg Chapman cover. So yeah, so that really this kind of movement, if you like. I met Genevieve Flynn at GenreCon in Australia, and we said, "Hey, where's all the Asian women in horror, and why isn't there an anthology looking at our work and our perspectives?" And so that's kind of where that originated. And when we finished that work, and it was just so well received, we decided we still had things to say, and that resulted in work called Tortured Willows, which Angela Eureka Smith and Christina Singh. And when we finished that, people said, "Well, what are you going to do next?" And so Ms. Painsborough said, "Oh, yes, we need to do something else." And so that became essays. And it's interesting because although there is some similarities between the 3 works, one is short stories, one is poetry, and the next one is essays. In fact, each of those different formats tease of those cultural tensions, the ideas of tradition, those generational traumas. So in fact, they all sort of teased out different ways of looking at things. And so I'm extremely
Yeah.
proud of the way that the movement has been, and also the reception to these books, which has been incredible.
Yeah. How so in exploring like these anthologies and stuff, did you find a huge group of Asian women horror writers around the world?
Yeah, it's interesting because at the beginning we thought, well, who should we ask? Who is
Yeah.
there? And so obviously our first thought was Rena Mason. She's been kind of instrumental in sort of waving the flag for Asian women in horror from, early on. In fact, hers may have been the first face that I saw and thought, you know what? She's doing it, so there's a space for us here.
Yeah.
And then meeting Genevieve was wonderful. And of course, so we sort of started putting the feelers out. And now that the Black Cranes is out, people are coming to us and saying, "Hey, have you read this person? And have you read this?" And suddenly this wonderful has kind of, it wasn't there. It's just that we weren't seeing them together collectively. And so it's wonderful now to have this opportunity to sort of lift up these voices that haven't really been heard. And of course, for Asian women, it's, first of all, you should be quiet. So that's why the word
Yeah.
unquiet has really resonated for people, because Asian women are not supposed to speak out and tell our truth. We're supposed to be quiet and subsume ourselves in service of family and community. And so instead, we are lifting our voices in service of family and community and individuals. And also, horror is not, we're supposed to be polite and nice, and horror is not something we should be doing. And of course, horror has always been about women's voices, always from the very beginning,
Right.
and, marginalized
Right.
voices and othered people. And so I think it is the perfect place for us. But those ideas of Asian women having a voice and horror, women, Asian women being in horror are just kind of incongruent with each other. And in fact, they are the perfect place to talk about these issues.
That's amazing. Speaking of like culture and stuff, like so many guests I've had, like their supernatural experiences are informed by their cultural background, whether it's nationality, race, or like religious background, or
Exactly.
ethnicity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
For
I find
you,
those.
for you, what
Absolutely.
did you grow up with?
Okay, so I am well, I'm half Chinese, I'm Chinese, and then I'm also, as we say in New Zealand, so my dad was European, sort of had European origins, Welsh and Spanish and what have you. And so, but I'm born here in New Zealand. I'm a third generation New Zealander on the Chinese side, and way back 8 generations or 9 generations on my dad's side. So, and of course, I'm lived in New Zealand, so this is, the myth and the cultural underpinnings of our Maori and Pacifica people are very prevalent here in New Zealand. And my husband is part Maori, and so my children are part Maori. And so, of course, that's very interesting to me as well. So I'm basically a bit of a mongrel, if you like. And I'm very interested in the sort of intersection of culture and myth, which I think all the interesting stories about ghosts and spirituality, and because they're all related, aren't they? Religion and even here in New Zealand, our legal underpinnings are, based on some mythological or
Oh,
cultural
wow.
concepts that are raised by our Maori and Pacifica peoples, so
Mhm.
which relate very similarly to my Chinese background. So it's very interesting and very exciting, and I think offer us new ways or even old ways of looking at the future and how we protect our environment and how we look after our marginalized peoples and those kinds of things. So I think those are exceedingly important intersections to explore. And it's just like when you mishmash genres, you always find something interesting and worthy
Yeah.
of exploration. And they kind of
Yeah.
thought experiments, if you like, because that's what fiction is. It helps us to make sense of the world, doesn't it? And understand things and process things in new and fresh ways.
Yeah. Do you remember the first either cultural mythology or ghost story or some that you heard as a kid?
Yeah, I would say that those tended to be around religion. My
Uh-huh.
mum and dad were in the church. My dad, they were the church treasurers and on the committee and that kind of thing. So there are those aspects. But also because I have lived in New Zealand, so those Maori cultural things were very prevalent, and the idea of mountains and rivers and lakes being our ancestors and nurturing us, and those kinds of spiritual things, which are they're quite close to the veil here in New Zealand. And so, but not so much my Chinese culture, which was kind of stifled because, my parents thought that to get ahead, I needed to be more Kiwi and more New Zealand. And so those things needed to be quiet, and I needed to stifle those things, and I think that's true of lots of colonized countries and Western countries where where there has been a colonizing influence, and so we've kind of obviously the dominant culture is the colonizer, and so that is tricky. It's very tricky, and so navigating that has been interesting. And for me now, I'm being braver about putting those things forward and investigating those wonderful aspects of my life and my background and where I live, that are so important to be discussed and brought out in the open and considered and reflected upon. So I think it's a very exciting time and for me personally, it's allowing me to investigate issues of identity, and otherness and expectation and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you remember what's the first sort of, whether it was a true story that you experienced or it's a story you heard from someone else? Do you remember the first like scary story you told someone else?
The first scary story I told someone else. Oh, I don't know. I was talking about this the other day in a conference about how, when we were little and the lights would go out, my dad would put around candles around the room and we would sit in the darkness, and just as a family, my mum, my two brothers and my sister, and we would tell kind of ghost stories. And then my dad at the end of it would sort of go gobbity gobbity goop, lights go on and the magic, and I can't tell you how many times that kind of magic happened. So,
Uh-huh.
so I guess those kinds of stories, what did I tell? I don't know. I think they would be, I cannot pinpoint the actual first ghost story. I'll have to think about it. But I do recall the moment, if you like, of those, because
Yeah,
you can
yeah, yeah.
imagine the flickering candle lights. And Dad was really big about not having dangerous things. He was a safety officer. So, that was
Right.
quite special that we would have candles, open flames in the house, flickering. It was a bit like a seance or an exorcism. So I remember the moment, but I don't know if I remember the story. But I also remember that it was magical that Dad made the lights come on, and I still don't know how
Yeah,
he did
yeah.
that.
My dad
So
used to do that when we were growing up in Paraguay, and power would go out all the time. And so my brother and I then would go around going, "All right, lights, come on!" Like, because we thought that's how it worked.
yeah, yeah, because electricity is magical, and I think that that's interesting, isn't it? Because there is just that very fine balance between science and magic, and what we don't
Yeah,
understand is magic, and what we do understand is kind of science, or supposedly, and that's it's interesting to me because at some point, where do we, I mean, it's just there's a very fine line, isn't there? And Dan Rabarts and I, when we put together our Hounds of the Underworld series, which I don't have on my desk, which is also with Raw Dog Screaming Pest, we wanted to do that. We wanted to investigate. We wanted to juxtapose the science ideas and also the mythological concepts, and how those things are often quite similar and married together. And so you can have a story where you have a mythological or sort of spiritual resolution to the story, but also that also marries with the scientific resolution for your story.
yeah, yeah. Okay, how about this? Your first story or attempted story of a horror story, writing it. Your first
Yeah,
attempt
okay.
at writing a horror
At
story.
writing a horror story. Well, I really started out writing, contemporary women's fiction actually, and children's fiction. And so because I kind of bought into that write what you know sort of attitude,
Yeah,
and so I was a runner, and so I wrote a sort of story about, how awful it is to run and how painful it is and how you have to give up, eating muffins and stuff like that. How your running shorts ride up your bottom and are uncomfortable. Those kinds of, which is really fun, but I kind of realized that I wanted to write more deeper, things that really resonated for me and made me frightened. So, but I was kind of doing that a little bit with short stories. So I think I wrote a short story about eugenics actually, and how imagine if in the future insurance companies, made you abort every child you had that had a potential disability. And that to me is kind of horror because that's possible, and the insurance companies have, you can't get insured if you have a pre-existing condition. And so in New Zealand, we have socialized medicine, so it's a little bit different. But that idea was really frightening to me because, we can now affect, genetics in quite profound ways. And so that to me is a horror story, although I think it was pitched more as science fiction. And then my first children's story is called Battle of the Birds, and I don't think I have it on my desk. It's the cover of it's out the back, and it's out here in this room. I think you can just see the cover on the wall. And that story was about traveling through time and dealing with homesickness because I was living in the United States at the time, and my little girl was completely homesick and missing her grandparents and missing the Bay of Plenty. And so I postulated sort of a big American eagle, which was in the shape of an effigy mound, flying back to New Zealand. And of course, we had an eagle here in New Zealand, but that was extinct. And so I drew on that. And in fact, my little character goes back in history and turns up in a place that she didn't expect. It's the same place, but it's 1,000 years, ahead of time. And so, because you can never go back to that same place, right? You never can go back. It's never the same. And so. And so that was kind of a horror story too, because I set it up in a war between the flighted birds, the birds that can fly, and the flightless birds, because a lot of our native birds are flightless, of course. And so, and the story is, if you like, a little horror story for children. You can't go back; it's a little different, and the world could be at war. And so there are aspects of horror. And in fact, I think horror is that wonderful genre where, it's like humor and romance where you can just pop it in anywhere. It transcends genre. It's not just this is all horror, or you can just put those elements in of where you are frightened, and the aspects that frighten you can go in any story. They don't have to be purely horror, if you like, that idea of blood and gore. It can just be unease. But it can be addressing the things that frighten us.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's like a lot of what you're saying. It makes me think it's hard to write about identity in this world without it touching some version of horror.
Yeah, I think so, because none of us, we all feel like imposters. None of us feel like we belong. It's finding our place and where we feel, comfortable, and that's a really hard thing. And I'm getting close to 60 now, and I still haven't found quite yet. Although I do feel that horror is my tribe. Those are my people. We're a little bit off the wall and a little bit weird, and we look at things at different ways, and they're the kindest folk, So I do feel that's my tribe, really. Yeah. And I don't think that horror has to necessarily be supernatural. I think that, there are just some things that just frighten us that are just complete reality. But I do love that spiritual aspect, and I think that they bring something a little more visionary, a little more surreal to those stories. And, and they allow us to suspend disbelief and look at things in different ways. So I do like the supernatural. But yeah.
Yeah, for me as a kid, I think horror was a way for me to believe that there was something beyond, like every time I saw a ghost story, as much as it scared me, it was like there was this weird level of comfort that came from knowing, oh, there's this whole thing that I can't explain. My parents can't explain. It just exists. That's beyond. And it gave me a strange comfort growing up.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because I think, isn't that what religion and myth and story is all about? It's about trying to make sense of things that we just don't understand, and and clearly some of those older myths and older lore are really about understanding what we didn't understand or still don't understand. Where do we go when we die? What happens to us, and what happens, what happens to the world going forward when there's technological changes and all of those sorts of things. And I think that stories really help us understand family and generations and all of and our connectivity to the world. And so I think you're right. I think that those things do give us comfort because they allow us to work through those things and process them and give us some kind of reason. And even if the magic doesn't quite, it has to be consistent, but it gives us this. There's a greater there's a greater power, or there's a reason or an explanation somewhere for this, even if we don't get it yet. And I think that does give us really wonderful comfort. That is the thing about horror. It's hopeful and gives us solace, does it not?
Yeah, I mean, it scares us too if it's good. Like, definitely. Reading your bio, a question popped out to me based on the title of one of your books. What is a monster to you?
Oh, wow, that is a great question. And obviously monster is metaphor for so many things, isn't it? It's a metaphor for all the things we're frightened of, and that could be being othered. It could be, urbanization. I mean, I think Godzilla is the monster of nuclear fallout, isn't it? And
Yes.
King Kong and Jaws. Don't go in the water. There's just all these monsters are metaphors for the things that frighten us. How much of the ocean is still unexplored and what we don't know, and so I just feel like monster is a wonderful metaphor for the things that we don't know that we still need to explore, and also a thing to protect. Here be monsters, that notion. And here in New Zealand we have, which is a serpent lizard monster, which I absolutely love and have explored. But it is also, we've codified that a little bit here in New Zealand into our lore. And so, we consult with our Maori elders where we have a taniwha in the way of something. So in actual fact, in New Zealand, a highway was moved because the Maori people believed that a taniwha exists in this place. And so they moved a highway in order to preserve that belief. And I think it is underpinned by some other things, like there's some, even though the belief is there, why is the belief there? And I think it's underpinned by things like a fault, an earthquake fault, or some other actual geophysical aspects. But the belief is there, if you like. And so in New Zealand, those things are very important, aren't they? To understand that there's often an underlying reason for those warnings and caveats being in place, and so it's showing respect for those significant landmarks that are important in our community.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. Are children like from at a young age about
We're doing better with that. Yes. I mean, yes, those are stories that we are told as children here in New Zealand, and oral stories mostly, but they're becoming, we're seeing much more of that in our literature. The funding facilities and are looking to do better at including those stories in our libraries. When I was growing up, it was very much a British colonial situation. So a lot of the materials that we read in schools were British. And so now we're doing much better. And in fact, we're even in 2022, so that's talking very recently, there's been a move to overhaul the history and the understanding of Maori culture as taught in our schools. Because basically, when I was at school, most of what was taught was basically from the time that the Europeans arrived in New Zealand, and not pre-New Zealand, pre the Europeans. And there's centuries of history that have been kind of sort of hidden and erased. And I think that lots of Western cultures are looking to do this, is to reinstate those oral histories and embrace the learnings and the understanding that are inherent in those oral histories that we have not paid more attention to. And so I think that that's a wonderful thing. And look at the stories that are going to come out of it. I'm very
Oh,
excited for
yeah.
that.
Yeah, that sounds
You
great.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, and also offering a whole group of our community a bit more understanding about their past and the impact on our everyday, which should be more prevalent. And I think that's happening more, for example, in the United States. Um, I hope so. I mean, I think interest in people like Stephen Graham Jones and Shane Hawke and the work that they're doing in raising Indigenous voices and those kinds of cultural underpinnings are really, really important. But there are other groups too, right, that have contributed to, for example, in the United States, the way that to the collective voices of the growth and progression of the United States and also Europe, parts of Europe. And so I think that's exciting and refreshing because those ways of looking at things can help with the way we move forward and protect our environment and set up social structures that are more equitable. Well, I would hope so anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say it's not just helps moving into the future, it's like absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
Um,
Look, just I'm thinking about the mental, looking at mental health and illness. You know, there was no such thing as that in Maori culture before the Europeans came because their society was very community based. So, and it wasn't just a mother and a father that raised the children. It was all of the communities. So, you know, aunties and uncles and so those terms, auntie and uncle and elders, are so much more important in Maori culture. And the idea of mental illness didn't kind of really exist. So they have a term for it, which kind of means sort of something along the way of thinks in their own space or is, you know, has a, you know, walks to the beat of a different drum, but they were embraced, those people, and nurtured as part of the community as individual
mm,
thinkers.
mm,
And yet in Western culture, they're sort of more stigmatized and demonized.
right.
And if we go back to that older way of thinking of if we just nurture those people and value them for the different way that they think and help them through instead of demonizing them, how much they have to offer. And, you know, just if you're neurodiverse, you're not, it's not wrong, it's just different. And I just think
Yeah.
that that's just such a wonderful way of perceiving mental illness, and we can help those people through. It's different. It's not wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Of course.
And so, what a wonderful way to look at things. And if we just go back to that and perhaps embrace that notion, we have a different way of dealing with mental illness in our communities. And just, oh, I just think that's just one way we can look at things differently. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I think it's essential to look at Indigenous approaches to social structures and to the way and to their ways of thinking for improving our lives going forward.
Yeah.
So much. It's not looking back; it's looking forward.
Yeah.
You know.
Random question. Have you ever thought of yourself as a monster?
Oh, definitely. Yes, definitely. I think that that's very true in Asian cultures. And I was having this conversation fairly recently with Angela Eureka Smith and Kiyomi Appleton Gaines, Genevieve Flynn, and Yvette Tan. So all Asian writers, but from different backgrounds, talking about Asian mythology and how all those sort of monsters are always women in Asian cultures. And Christina Singh says it's because, you know, we have just cause. And I think it's because Asian women
Oh,
are not allowed to have a voice while we're living. So we have to die to do it, to be able to come back and sort of, you know, have our say and walk among the people and frighten them to hell because, you know, we haven't been able to say it in our lives. And And I feel that's kind of true that women's voices have been suppressed in Asian cultures, where they are very patriarchal, and women's life choices are sort of down to having children and raising them, and being quiet about our own wants and needs and desires. And so we have to die and become hungry ghosts in order to, to get our desires and to feed that hunger. And so, I think
do you embrace that? Like your monster side?
yeah, I mean, I'm definitely monstrous in that I'm writing horror, and I'm being a writer is already subversive, right? It's speaking
Yeah.
out, and so yes, I definitely am monstrous. And again, it's a metaphor, isn't it? I hope
Yeah.
I'm not too monstrous in real life, but it is. We are meant to be quiet women. We're not meant to have a say, and so just by daring to write, we're already being subversive. Are we?
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
that's
Definitely.
the case.
Is there anything that's you find too scary to write about?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and people have asked me about this before. Do I frighten myself? And I write about the things that frighten me, but can I frighten myself in my writing? I don't know. I think my friends frighten me, but I think it's because I don't know what to expect. Whereas when you write, it's like, can you tickle yourself? If you know you're going to do this, that's your intent, is to do this. Then can you make yourself laugh if you tickle yourself? And can you frighten yourself if you're the one writing the horror? And I think that's the difference. You know what's coming. So it's like watching a film you've seen before. Do you get that jump scare the second time? Maybe
Yes.
not. Sometimes if it's cleverly done, yes, maybe so.
Or if you're high enough, I guess. That's
Maybe.
was there I know, growing up with your father, the electricity magician, and this Maori like cultural, like like oral history and mythology and all that stuff. Is there anything that you've experienced that you're like to this day, I can't really explain it? Like, not that you care or you need to explain it, but you go, I don't know I can't really explain what happened.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, actually, my mum talks about that a lot. So she is full Chinese. I'm born in New Zealand, but she says her dad sat on her bed after he died and had a chat with her, and then she also said to me not long ago, because my dad died at the beginning of the pandemic, and she said that dad came back and had a chat with her as well. And so, and I believe my mother entirely. She's not a person to make things up. And and I said to her, well, that's interesting, because dad did not believe in that at all. He did early in his life. He did believe in Christian beliefs, but in later life he was very disillusioned by that, and so he didn't think that would happen. And so for him to come back, then he must be telling us something, right? He's telling us that maybe we got that wrong, and there is something else out there. But so yes, I think that those beliefs of my mother are very. My husband is a physicist. He does not believe those things, and yet I do kind of, and I don't. So
Yeah.
I do believe in spirituality, and I definitely believe that there is this. Catherine Mansfield talks about a savage spirit that walks the land here in New Zealand, and I feel that. So you can be.
What is that?
Yeah, so New Zealand has this funny twilight that isn't quite dark, and it isn't quite light, and that it's a very strange moment of the day. But also, it's very isolated New Zealand. We're off the end of the world, and you can turn off the main road and suddenly be nowhere, just in the middle of nowhere. And it's if your car breaks down, you could be just anywhere, just so far from any help, from
Lord.
just completely isolated. And there's that feeling of, I mean, you can just you can be walking in town and there'll be somewhere where, we have little bits of forest in the middle of our townships, and the hair can can rise on the back of your neck, and you can just know that you're not alone. And it is just, you are alone, you're totally alone, but you're not alone. And that's what I mean about the savage spirit of this country, where you just feel completely isolated. There's this loneliness, this tension, and that is a underlying spirituality that just exists here. And I feel, come down, you'll feel it. You will know it. It is just,
Yeah.
it's pervasive here in New Zealand, and we all feel it, where you just do not, there are people around, and yet you are completely isolated and alone.
That's
and
wild.
it's that, yeah. Now it's almost that folksy horror that you probably know. That I'm
Yeah.
talking about, that small town horror.
Yeah.
And that feeling is just very much New Zealand. And so, yeah, come down, have a feel. You'll know that what I'm talking about. But Catherine Mansfield talked about it as the savage spirit that walks this land.
Oh, it's definitely on my bucket list now. Like, one last question. One last question and one short question after that. But do you remember the first horror story you read where you were like, I want to do this. I want to write a straight up horror story?
Oh,
Or movie
I don't remember that I ever made that connection, except for after I wrote the women's contemporary fiction, and realized that it wasn't what I wanted. But I remember first reading, Dad read, we read Pinocchio, and just the whole, I've said this before, but I think the whole idea of that just resonated for me. Pinocchio is, the story in the original story, if you're a bad child, you get skinned and made into a drum, and I just think, and that is so much Asian culture, be a good girl, or else you become a monster. You'll be a hungry ghost, and just so that notion of Pinocchio, that badge child. I was a very good child. I was a really good child. That notion of that, and so to me, so I realized that just how much horror can really influence the way we operate. I mean, Jaws, when Jaws came out, none of us went in the water, right? We were just like, oh, don't go in the water. Just the impact of horror just from that early age. So I would have been 4 or 5 when I first heard the story of Pinocchio, and that just really resonated for me. So did I make the conscious decision then? Probably not, but it still gives me frisons even now to think. I don't know when I made a conscious decision. I think was probably after that first novel that I knew that horror was the place I needed to be. But early on, did I make that conscious decision? No, but I had that connection. And I watched The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was the first really horror movie, where I thought, that just secrets, and that resonated for me on the idea of, having a secret and something being closed up and, and the whole idea of women in the attic, keep your mad mother, your mad wife in the attic and poor women that have just, she's not really necessarily mad. She just doesn't agree with you. Right. And so that to me, those kinds of things, those sort of pivotal things on the way to being a horror writer, I think. So did I ever really make the conscious decision? Possibly just but that was late in the piece, these other groundbreaking moments or sort of turning points where I had this idea that, hey, hang on, horror can really resonate, and make you do something, that traditional girls should be good, be a good child and don't stray from the path. And then that sort of idea that women, again, when you're growing up, a woman should be is something to be hidden in the attic, and if you disagree, this is what happens to you. If you're a hysterical woman, you get locked in the attic, and some younger girl will come along and take your place. And that kind of thing. So there were these pivotal moments, but I think, can I say there was this light bulb moment where I said, I must write horror. Now I just know that it's my place. But did I have a light bulb moment? I don't know. I can't say that I kind of did, except perhaps after I wrote that contemporary women's novel and knew that it wasn't where I needed to be. So
yeah, amazing. The final question is: do you have another book coming out soon, or either your own writing or one you're editing?
Right. So editing this one, and Remains to be Told, is just released. It's a collection of those savage spirit stories that talk about horror in New Zealand. So I hope my friends will pick this up and visit New Zealand and sort of find out what frightens us here. And also coming on the 7th of November is Under Her Eye, which is a collection of horror poetry in support of the Pixel project, horror poetry by women. And that is to eliminate violence against women. So that'll be coming out. I think it's International Day of Prevention of Violence Against Women. Oh, Dispatches, thank you for mentioning that one. That is a cosmic horror novella set in World War One, an epistolary story that just came out from PS Publishing. So it's been a busy few months for me.
Yeah.
And so next year I have a prose poetry collection coming out from the Cuba Press, which is kind of my own personal response to the Black Cranes movement. So it's just me, that one, and a film coming out and stuff. So it's going to be
you're
a
clearly
very busy
not
year.
doing enough. You're not doing enough.
Yeah, something like that.
Lee, I gotta tell you, you're one of my new heroes. So
Thank you.
I think
That's very
just
kind.
your work and just talking with you, you're absolutely amazing. And I'm like, oh wow, there's these kids I work with. I'm gonna have them definitely look up your work. And
thank you. Well, look, if we can bring some young people over to the dark side, that's always wonderful.
yeah, a kid just asked me, can a children's book be like horror? I was like, yeah, they're all horror.
Someone needs to tell R.L. Stein that, children's children's book can be horror. They can absolutely address, and I think I do think so. And I think children are actually looking for that. They're looking for answers to the things that frighten them. So definitely, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lee. And thank you everyone for joining in for this amazing episode. I have had so much fun talking with Lee Murray. Please check out all of her projects, all of it. We look forward to seeing you again next episode.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.